Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this panel discussion on the proposed inclusion of shipping into the EU emissions trading scheme. This is a hybrid event, so we have an audience, a very glamorous looking audience in the room with us, and we also have people joining by internet link. So I am Philip Roche, I'm a partner here at Norton Rose, and I'm the moderator today. And we have a great panel of speakers who I'm delighted have joined us today. And so I'll introduce those. The first is Ulrik Frorup, and he's Special Projects and External Affairs Director at Bureau Veritas in Paris. He's had a long career of 30 years in the group as a technical and operations manager, taking from Denmark to France, US, Singapore, and Korea. And graduated as a naval architect from Denmark Technical University, held a diploma in business economics. Next is Jacob Armstrong, and he's a sustainable shipping officer at the Brussels-based NGO Transport and Environment, T&E, managing advocacy work. His background is in EU transport policy, with experience in the European Associations of Ports, Inland Ports, and the European Commission. Tom Strang is probably well known to most of us. Tom is with Carnival Corporation, PLC, and he's Senior Vice President of Maritime Affairs. He's been with Carnival for 21 years in a variety of operational corporate roles, currently spending most of his time on the decarbonisation journey. Mark Jackson, to my right, was appointed Chief Executive Officer of the Baltic Exchange in January 2017, previously been a Director of the Baltic and served as its Chairman from 2009 to 2012. Mark has over 38 years of shipping industry experience, doesn't look it. He's worked for as a shipbroker and joined AM Nomikos in London and was Chief Commercial Officer of the AM Nomikos Group in Athens. And I hope that we will be joined by Harry Fafalios, Chairman of the Greek Shipping Cooperation Committee. Harry is a well-known face to all of us. He's contributed to so much to London shipping over the years. So a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us. So the subject today is the EU's slightly stronger than a suggestion that maritime will be included in the European Union emissions trading scheme, part of the Green Deal Fit for 55, 55% reduction, carbon emissions measured against 1990 to 2030. And as part of this strategy, maritime is to be included. A very, very brief background. The EU ETS has been around since 2004. It's the most mature carbon trading system. It operates as a cap and trade system. So a maximum amount of allowances are made available. These are allocated to participants either via free allowances or more normally by auction, where the participants purchase the allowances to emit carbon. The UK obviously would have been part of all this had it remained in Europe, but having left, it does appear as though the UK will include shipping in the UK ETS when that comes about, although they haven't made any firm proposals yet, whereas they already have made firm proposals in relation to power and aviation. So briefly, the proposals, so all types of shipping over 5,000 tonnes will incrementally become subject to the EU ETS, those ships operating in the EU. So if you arrive in an EU port, you will be required to surrender your EU allowances, EUAs as they're called, equivalent to the following amounts in relation to ships. So in 2023, they are saying that you would have to surrender allowances of up to 20% of your verified emissions, verified, of course, through the MRV process, which has been going since 2018. And it won't be just intra-EU voyages that are captured by this, but also the EU proposes that 50% of emissions from voyages which start or end outside of the EU will be caught. So 100% of emissions intra-EU, 50% for those voyages coming outside. And it is flag neutral, so all ships will be subject to it. So I think that's probably enough as of a background. What I think we should start with is I think just just get a few minutes, a couple of minutes, please, from each panelist, just to get an initial thought as to this suggestion, and then we'll get into the debate. And with the debate, I think what we'll do is, because the debate over whether this should happen or not generates more heat than light, I would like to start really by talking about the practicalities of it. So if it is introduced, how it will work, what it will cost, how you will deal with this, what the admin will be. So it might sound a little bit back to front, but it seems to me if we deal with that sort of thing first, and then we can get into the debate as to whether this is a good or bad thing, because I think that might get a life of its own, and we'll miss out just talking about the practical details of EU ETS. So perhaps I could start in the room with you, Mark. Just a couple of thoughts on this suggestion from the EU.
Okay. Yes. Well, thank you. I think maybe first of all I'll sort of say, you know, as the Baltic, we try and remain independent, because we have members who are both owners, charterers, business services, and so certainly at this point in the evolution of this market, we are very much in a gathering phase. But what we do try to do is provide some sort of commercial, let's say, opinion as to what will be the impact. And I know we're going to talk about actual costs, but I thought maybe one of the ways, just to put it in perspective, we published recently the carbon footprint for all the routes that we actually assess. And one of those routes is iron ore from Brazil to Rotterdam. That's 170,000 tons, goes into Capesize, so standard Baltic Capesize description. It's just under 4,000 tons of carbon. So today, basis the 20%, which is sort of 2023, it will be a cost of about $24,000. That's basis $50 a ton for the carbon at the moment. So that's 20% of the emissions. Only 50% of those count, because you're only touching once in the EU. So that's 24,000. For the full 100%, when you're getting there in 2026, it's a shade over $120,000. Now, just to say that, so at the lows, that's about 14 cents a ton currently, basis 20%. So that's in our very low markets when it got down to about $3 a ton for the freight. You're talking about 5%. And today we've got rates around 15, just under, and so that's about 1%. So just to put a bit of context around what the costs are. So the initial 2023 at 24,000 for a Capesize does sound like a reasonable introduction. Now, as you go down the sizes, actually the cost of freight, or big ships are actually very efficient. Big ships are very efficient. That's one of the things that this study's come out in terms of what we did in terms of EOIs and everything else, is you can see very low energy efficiency operating scores, low on the bigger ships. The smaller ships are higher. So, efficiencies of scale should play into this discussion.
Thank you very much indeed. Jacob, would you like to go next?
Yeah, of course. First of all, thanks very much for having us on, and apologies I can't be in London. But yeah, so from transport and environment's perspective, so just to kind of maybe a word on us, we're kind of Europe's biggest transport advocacy organization. And we've been working hard on the shipping ETS. And for us, it is a good proposal from the Commission. And just to note, I think it should be said that a shipping ETS will go through. We will have a shipping ETS. There might be amendments to it, but it will happen. And for us, it's a good proposal so far. There's things to improve, but basically it does what it seeks out to achieve, which is to make shipping pay its fair share, to kind of work to bridge the price gap between dirty and clean fuels, and then finally to generate revenue. So just to go into maybe the first of those three things is about shipping's fair share, because I think this is something we always have to come back to. It's always worth to kind of take a step behind and say, we do have a climate crisis on our hands. What happened this summer was a kind of rude reminder of how serious these issues are. And shipping in Europe, it pollutes about the same amount as Belgium. and it hasn't paid for its environmental kind of impact. And so, it would be the same thing as kind of since environmental legislation started happening, to say to Belgium that they didn't need to do anything, but all the other European countries did. This isn't fair. So it's high time really that that shipping does its fair share, and the ETS is a good way to do that. We've had it since 2005. It works well. And Jen, yeah, I mean, it's not going to kind of bridge the price gap. It's not going to lead us to decarbonisation. But as I say, it will help. And as with a basket of other measures, it will help. So basically, just to end there and basically say, it's a good proposal. There is work to be done in terms of the practicalities, but but we're hopeful going forward.
Great, thanks very much, Jacob. Dan, would you like to go?
Okay, so thank you for the invitation to participate on this panel. We are also in Bureau Veritas an independent company, so we have no wish to criticize governments and governmental organizations trying to lead the way and setting new standards for avoiding this climate change. We have to succeed in this business. Now, seen from a class society and a verifier of greenhouse gases reporting, we do recognize that shipping is international with no borders. So we hope to see very soon a harmonization between the regions in terms of the requirements. And in fact, we really like to see fair competition between the world regions. We also like to see clear and accurate requirements so we can concentrate on what it's all about, the technical solutions for decarbonization. And I think also very important is that we sincerely hope that the money which will be paid in taxes will come back to the industry as support to do the innovation that we need to do. On our side, we follow the developments in IMO through IX as well. And we, of course, follow very closely the outcome of and the life of these directives. So we have launched some internal analysis to evaluate the consequences for shipping, both regulatory but also cost-wise. And obviously, we want to support our clients the best we can.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Tom, last but not least.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. As Phil mentioned, I'm Tom Strang from Carnival. We are obviously a cruise line in a slightly different sector to perhaps many of the others. And, I think it's pretty clear that we have some challenges, in particular, as certain segments of the Fit for 55 package really do pick out passenger services and container services in some areas, particularly in the fuel EU maritime deal. I think first up, I think the cruise industry is a supporter of the long-term objectives of the EU Green Deal. Carnival has made a statement that we're committed to where our aspiration is to be net carbon neutral operations in Europe by 2050, and that's clearly something that we believe in is really important for us in our decarbonisation journey. We've managed to we've peaked our emissions already, and we're already on a downward trend despite the growth that we have in our sector and in our own company. But this is very challenging. There's no two ways about it. And I think if the EU and industry want to meet these ambitious carbon neutrality deadlines, then it's really going to be critical to address the requirements for the availability and supply of these alternative maritime fuels, because that's where we certainly see the biggest challenge at the present time. And I think, as Dan has mentioned, and Jacob's mentioned, we are very much favouring an international. We would much prefer to see a global set of regulations at the IMO. I think the challenge that we see at the moment is, and I think we all have to remember that this package of regulations is at the first phase. It's the Commission's proposal. It now has to go through the Parliament, the Council, and through a process. And there are going to be changes. Where we see some of those challenges are going to be is the compatibility with the discussions that are going on at the IMO as we speak, with regards to potential market-based measures in the future, with regards to proposals around fuel initiatives, many of which are building upon some of the suggestions made by the European Union. But I think as a shipping company that operates worldwide, clearly the challenges of running in and out of different countries or different regions, national systems with different recording requirements. For example, if the UK does do something that's different to the EU, then, what are the chances of double reporting, double counting that we see coming into this? I think that's one of the other challenges we see where we look at the fuel EU maritime versus the ETD versus all of those fit for 55s. It's not just an ETS. The challenges there are if some of the changes that have been proposed around the Energy Taxation Directive are applied directly, if some of the changes in the fuel EU maritime are applied, then this is much more than just an ETS. And I think that's really understanding that order of magnitude is really important. And at this time, it's almost impossible to make a calculation as to what that cost is going to be. And I think that's where we see some of the critical challenges. We clearly think there needs to be support for R&D, and we think that simulating fuel price, simulating through some form of carbon pricing is one mechanism. And we'd like to really see that this clarity though across all segments and sectors, so that the fair share is paid. And I think one other thing I would say specifically from the cruise sector and in Carnival's case is that our industry does underpin shipbuilding in Europe. We are by far the biggest segment that does build ships, has massive employment in Europe. And currently, I think part of that challenge is going to be, I'm not going to plead poverty, but we are recovering from a pandemic. We're in a very difficult sector. We've only got 1/3 of our fleet back in operation at the moment, but there's a lot of challenges out there that need to be taken into account as we begin this in this journey. I'll leave it at that for the moment, but look forward to the discussion on this panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thanks for all those comments. I think we still haven't managed to successfully link up with Harry. I don't know, dark side of the moon. Still there. But hopefully you'll join us at some stage. Great. Well, let's get it going. Do you mind if I start with you, Mark, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how will it look to the ship owner? So I think there's obviously going to be a contrast between a ship owner who's incorporated in the EU and doing a lot of intra-EU voyages, and then there's going to be a whole set of ship owners who are Japanese or Korean, and so they will be effectively entering into EU waters and having to surrender allowances for voyages in. How do you see it's going to work?
Well, I mean, from a simple point of view, it's as it were, where they touch, it's it's going to become a regional issue. And the fact that as soon as the ship arrives, it doesn't really matter where they're owned or what flag. It's the fact that they touched. At the moment, it is still very conceptual, because even on the calculations I opened with, I based them on the full amount of carbon that the vessel emitted for the voyage. But at the moment, we don't know what those allowances are. And so that's going to come out of the reporting that's happening at the moment, and they might decide that it's going to be 100. Is it going to be the average of all these ships coming in? And again, the buckets on which people use in terms of saying, okay, your ship fits this bucket, you might be a smaller one or a bigger one, they're quite wide at the moment. So I think the problem is, even today, we're certainly as the Baltic, we're trying to keep this as a high level discussion and just sort of saying, okay, there is much that we don't know, and it's that way I feel myself going into that, known and unknowns and things, but I'll avoid that. So I think, and I'm sure we're going to touch on it, the real bit is going to be about how do you pass this to the customer? So let's just say we agree, all the allocations come, it's going to work. And at the moment, the EU is very much focused on saying the technical manager, the person who runs the ship, is responsible. But, and ultimately they're saying, yeah, this will get to the customer. But at the moment, the industry knows that the owner of the asset, who's actually having to invest in that asset and, to reduce these emissions, doesn't get recompensed very quickly for what they do, because you have a commercial market operating. And as soon as you put the total responsibility upon the owner, then it becomes a negotiation between the owner and the charterer. And the owners don't often find themselves in a very good, strong negotiating point to extract the value that they want for the use of their vessel. let alone the penalties that are now coming towards them. So for me, I'm not going to, because I could go on quite a bit, but I think to me, that's the big question that the industry has really got to try and work out, is how can we pass that cost from the asset owner down to the end user, so the fact that it gets shared through that whole chain. And at the moment, by, as it were, just bundling it all together and not treating this as sort of a tax on everybody, it's something that we've got to work out. And I think that if we just leave it to market forces, I think it's not going to happen for quite a while. It's going to sit upon the owners, and that's going to be a heavy burden for them.
And you were saying about the price of carbon being around 50, and I suppose the risk for the owner is that that changes. So he's made his charge party agreements at a certain rate, and then the price of carbon goes north, and that lag is kind of.
Well, I actually think that the risk of price changing carbon, tools will come. These are high value assets. We're in the business of providing derivative markets for freight itself. There will be, at the moment we talk about that carbon market, and even in the paper it talks about a secondary market. So as an owner, you can go off and deal in the secondary market. There are going to be brokers that pop up that are going to be happily trading in that secondary market, and a futures market will come ahead, and there'll be an opportunity to hedge your price. And some people will embrace that and other people won't. But I'm actually not so worried, or not. I don't think the market should be so concerned about it going from 150 to 100, because we saw fuel prices, in 2010 at $600 a ton. But the good thing about fuel is you can pass it down the chain. You can pass it to the customer. It's a very quick price discovery. You end up with possibly a 30-day mismatch between voyages, whereby somebody has lost and somebody has won. But it comes out into that supply chain very quickly. Here at the moment, it's not clear how we can get those price changes into the supply chain very quickly. And I think and people get a bit too caught up in the detail of, how's the allowance going to be set and how is it not, rather than saying we need to focus upon how does this price get through the supply chain. Because if that becomes clearer, the owners will be happier to participate, and in general, the industry will see that the costs can go to the customer at the end of the day. Yes, there are risks involved, and companies are used to dealing with risks, but yeah, get it through the chain so that it comes back to the people who want these goods at the end of the day.
So Jacob, Mark was saying that there's this lag between the possible lag between the allowances needing to be surrendered and then recovering those costs from the customers down the chain. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, in general, I think Mark's brought up a very, very important point, and this is something during the legislative process, or before the Commission proposal, that we were actually working with the Union of Greek Ship Owners about. I think one of the important points is that exactly we need, in terms of going forward, in terms of making sure that the proposal is strong and kind of useful for ship owners as possible, is to get this to make sure that these costs can be passed along. What we do have in the proposal now, there is an article which allows or kind of pushes the commercial operator to pass on to be responsible for the final costs, but obviously we need something stronger than this. And there is a couple of things that have been kind of mentioned, the price stabilization mechanisms, and this is something we're looking at as well in terms of if we can create a mechanism. One of the things we've been working on recently is if a carbon floor price would actually help that. So carbon floor price, when the UK was in the ETS, they had a carbon floor price for coal, which meant that basically coal had to have a minimum price. And this would be a way, for example, for ship owners, if there is certainty about the price each year, that they could put this in their contracts and they could be aware, okay, this year it's going to be X, next year it's going to be Y, and pass on the costs. So it's absolutely, I mean, we see this as an important point, and I think there is broad, it's not total, but I think there's broad understanding that this issue needs to be worked on. So I'm hopeful that in Parliament accounts we get somewhere with this. But again, this is somewhere where I think, we as NGOs looking for a successful policy, as well as industry and authorities, will need to work together on this. But it is an important point.
Thanks, Jacob. And Tom, obviously, relationship with your customers is a bit different to sort of customers that Mark was talking about.
Yeah, well, we're B2C. You know, our customers pay directly for the cruise, and depending upon which market we're selling into, depends very much upon the regulatory format as to how much is from a taxation perspective, or it can be passed directly back to customers, or how much we can incur in the ticket price. And I think part of the challenge here is you know, I think is you wanted to talk, you know, about the operational aspects. So clearly, you know, there is a concern, you know, from different companies, you know, when I'm sitting in different fora, you know, chairing different committees, you know, a lot of the smaller operators are very concerned about how they'll be able to enter into a marketplace as a single operator. And I think one of the things that I find is helpful in the EU proposals is that we are looking at this at a company level, at a group level. So that is an advantage which some in the industry push for at the IMO, and we weren't able to get accepted in other discussions. So clearly there is some opportunities there to join forces, get together to be able to be in a better position. But it is going to be challenging, and I think particularly for companies that haven't traditionally hedged on fuel price, for example, or done a lot of price control in that side of the marketplace. But I think one of the other speakers mentioned, you know, we have seen times when fuel prices were significantly high, and right now, if you're looking at the price of some fuels in the marketplace, and I'm not going to discuss which directly, but there are some fuels in the marketplace today which are very high right now, and therefore, when we look at the ETS, I think in some respects, by comparison to some of the challenges that our sector in particular is going to see within other parts of the Fit for 55, actually the ETS, I'm not going to say it's going to be easy, and please don't misquote me on this, it's going to be challenging. But I think it perhaps is not as challenging as some of the other proposals that we've seen. That being said, how much can we pass on to customers? That's going to be something that we're going to have to see. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do that, because clearly, you know, that's going to hurt people in their pocketbook, and that's going to be something that we've got to look at. But society will have to pay. You know, I think all of us believe as individuals we have to pay for this, and that's something that we've got to look at and see how that works. But I think it's going. You know, there are things in this that are good. There are things that I think are going to be challenging, and I think for us, that's really as we begin to move down this. For me, the key point is going to be where are the funds spent that are raised. And I really would like to see more being earmarked for maritime, because as a hard to abate sector, we really need to see that money going into infrastructure development. You know, if we're to believe what some are telling us, that ammonia, perhaps not for the cruise sector, and hydrogen is the fuel of the future, there's just zero infrastructure for that today. And we've got to begin to see infrastructure being built. And I know that's supposed to be dealt by the Fuel EU maritime piece of the package, but frankly, it's going to cost a massive amount, and who's going to pay for that?
Quite. Dan, maybe talking about fuel and infrastructure, do you have any thoughts on Tom's comments there?
Oh, he's still muted. He's chatting.
You're on mute there, Dan.
Okay, sorry, thank you. Well, for us, I mean, we have through our activities in this decarbonization discussion, we are fairly aware that there will be this huge, massive investment. I mean, one of the things we can see is that the shipping business is so optimized that to change that, it's not just the shipping itself; it's everything around it, and this is where the trouble comes in, because we will have to get all the stakeholders to buy into this, and this is also where, as I started to say, that we want to see where the funds going to be, how will the politicians assure that the investment into the industry will in fact come up with some ideas which are calibrated both for short-term and long-term innovation, because some of the alternative fuels we have today are not and will not be ready in a very short time. So we will have to find maybe some transition solutions, and this whole setup of how this will be funded, it's going to be, I think it's going to be a very long discussion with so many stakeholders. But I follow Tom very well in the cost issue, that it's going to be very, very expensive. We can do it, but it's going to be expensive.
We can do it.
Can I have a follow-up thing, and maybe Jacob can help here as well, because we have again, as you proceed through the discussion, you assume that the owner will know how many times he's going to call the EU, and so you have these sort of auctions, and it's based on an annual emission, so you can see how many ship owners are going to have to be dealing in this secondary market. So I suppose the question is, do you think this ETS will become, let's say, a more frequent auction? Are we talking about weekly auctions? Now, this is where my knowledge goes a bit, maybe it is weekly at the moment, but do we have an answer for that? Has Jacob got an answer on how an owner is going to manage it? Do they just come in as soon as they fixed and then have to look at both markets?
So yeah, to come back briefly on that, and then maybe I'll respond to some other stuff. But in terms of the ETS, I mean, I think when new sectors are added, there is a lot of apprehension, obviously, about how exactly it works. But the thing about the ETS is it's a very, very flexible mechanism. So you can, I mean, again, it's onto the ship owner or the operator in many cases how they decide to pay. Do they hedge? Do they buy allowances earlier, and then kind of depends them as things go on? You can, I mean, it is simple to buy allowances. It's even if you register, we could go on now and then buy a couple of allowances if we were a polluter in the EU. But it is possible to do so. And there's other things for smaller companies. You can kind of essentially delegate to these very big kind of houses that deal with these things. So it is a flexible mechanism. There is different ways that you can apply. So I think in some senses, I think the industry shouldn't be so worried. And I think what Tom almost said, that it's going to be an easy. I can't quote him on that, but it was almost there. But no, and then just maybe to come back onto the point Tom raised and Dan went forward in terms of the earmarking. I think when we go past the practicalities, it is going to be funds that are important and exactly what does them. And if I can make a slightly political point, which is that for us, this phase-in period, which is kind of which we didn't expect before the proposal, this for us is a big mistake. This is a big error, because what we see is that when price signals aren't there, when full price signals aren't there, no one acts. And so if we want the technology, if we want to invest in these technologies, then or if we want kind of the liners just to go a little bit slower when they come into Europe, then we have to have the 100% allowances. And I think that there is some confusion over the percentages, but let's just say, let's get rid of the phase-in, and then you retain this scope, which is 50-50, 50-25. But for us, basically, phase-in is very difficult because you're not getting all the funds and you're delaying the price signal. So two kind of points there.
Thanks very much, Jacob. And we're talking about this, about going off and buying allowances. What sort of administrative burden is this going to be? A lot of shipping companies, SMEs, they are lean. They already have enough on their plate with ESG and all the other regulations that have been coming in recently. Is this going to be easy for a medium-sized ship owner to manage? I don't know who'd like to say that, Mark.
I think ship owners have many supporting, have a lot of support. A lot of people want to support ship owners because they want to, be paid for those services. So I think this is a classic area where you will see, people spring up, trying to make business services out of this. And I think, a lot of ship owners are used to doing some sort of hedging, whether that's physical or whether, maybe they've been a bit more reluctant to go into derivatives. But they're certainly used to hedging their forex, putting in negotiating finance, and I think this will come into that as it were area of operation, and there'll be pooling. I think that's another area why you might end up with smaller owners going into pools, because this is then again another sort of service that pools will start to offer. So again, I think it's adding another layer of cost, but I think at the beginning there'll be a lot of people trying to help ship owners.
Yes, and I mean the market is very mature. There are a lot of brokers already giving that assistance to industry and aviation, and so I would have thought that they will see an opportunity. And
yes, I think in general though, you can see when there's an unknown, people do as long as they can pin down the costs, they will go into, they like having the knowns, such as was proposed, as in a minimum cost for carbon. Or what they like to do is go into some sort of, floating rate type of agreement with a pricing mechanism behind it so that they know what it is, and then leave it to somebody else to manage the actual risks of it. So I think there's enough tools out there. The owners got pretty sophisticated these days, but it's just knowing, as this thing unfolds, and the real costs will be in the detail.
Right. I mean, Tom, you're at the other end of sophistication. A very sophisticated ship owner. Would that be something that you would farm out, or would you do that yourselves, do you think?
I can't really comment on this one, Phil, at the moment. I think, yes, we are a big operation. We buy around about 3.5 million tons of fuel a year, something like that, and that's publicly disclosed. So you can go onto our websites to see what our carbon emissions are. But I think this is going to be very new for us. I think one of the challenges is going to be, who's your counterparty in this? And one of the things we see is that if you're not EU based, you're not European based, then the administration that you're going to be dealing with to surrender allowances, etc., it looks a little messy at the moment. It looks a little bit challenging. It depends upon, first port of call, maximum number of calls in 2020. Now, 2020 is not a good year for the cruise industry because we had ships laid up all over the place. So that's going to be challenging. So I think, and we've even got ships that are flagged in European countries, which may not be dealt with by that country. So there's a lot in the detail that still needs to be worked through. And I think this is where a lot of ship owners are finding the challenges at the moment. And certainly as we begin to look into this, and I'll come back to Jacob, none of this is going to be easy, Jacob. It's going to be challenging. I think what I'm saying is I think there are more difficult proposals in the Fit for 55 package at the moment to deal with. I think for us, the key is going to be understanding where those opportunities lie, to look at, as we've seen colleagues saying, around the hedging, et cetera. Is that something that we want to get more? Do we want to start looking at a different mechanism and a different set of processes? And we're doing that review at the present time to understand that and where that will end up. But as a large ship owner, you'd expect us to be able to manage that. We have a fuel team, we have a large centralized financial function which can probably manage these kind of aspects, but it is new. And every time there's something new, there's usually going to be challenges which we didn't become aware of, which later on, particularly when they're regulatory, can often form problems. We've had enough challenges with the EU MRV not recording the ships in the right place with the right amounts. This process is not as robust as it really needs to be for a regulation yet, but we've got to start and we've got to keep something moving. Ideally, I'd love to see this happening at the IMO, of course, but we're certainly going to happen there. And I think just to come back to the piece I said before about where the money gets spent, we did a quick look, and as far as I can see, none of the funds that the member states have allocated from the ETS are earmarked for maritime, not a single one. And I think that's something that's got to change. And I think that's where we'd look to those environmental NGOs to push hard on those organizations, because we are a hard to decarbonize sector. And we need to see, it's like anything. If we're getting involved in something new for the first time, we want to see a return on that investment that we're making. And that return has to be in building infrastructure and encouraging fuel suppliers and member states to stand up to what are frankly their obligations, and we have to remember that. And typically this is something that gets forgotten about in these things, is the member states are required to make sure the fuel is available in those locations.
Thanks very much. So before we move on, and we're going to talk a little bit about the whole issue of carbon leakage and voyages from outside the EU. Just on this kind of element, does anybody have any questions on what we've discussed? If you could just say your name and where you're from.
Sure, Tom Washington Platts. So this is just developing Tom's question, which is that what clarity is there on how the funds garnered will be deployed?
Jacob, why don't you?
He's the only one.
Could you, I didn't quite hear. Did you say what clarity is there on how the funds are going to be sent? Was that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. No. Listen. So on how the ETS funds are already spent and how they will be spent. Basically, what happens with the ETS is so everyone pays their allowances, and then all the money goes to. So the majority of the money goes back to the member states, and there's a kind of complicated calculation for which member state gets more money, and then some of the let's say the developing the more developing member states, often in the east, they receive slightly more based on different calculations. But so basically the majority goes back to member state pockets, but then a small amount goes to what's now called the Innovation Fund. And this is basically a fund that you can shipping companies can already apply to. And this is one of the things in our conversations with the European Commission. They do say often there's just this lack of communication. So, if you are a shipping company, if you are involved, I do I suggest that you do look up this innovation fund. There are opportunities there. Some shipping companies have already applied and have got grants from this fund. So there are quite interesting things happening there. And there's they do lots of interesting things in terms of fuels as well and renewable energy. But anyway, so all of that to say, most of it goes back into the member states. A small amount goes into the innovation fund. We are pushing, Tom. So this is for you as well. We are pushing to have some funds go directly back into the industry. The problem is, of course, that earmarking is difficult from a regulatory point of view. There are ways around that, of course, and we are exploring those. But yeah, essentially, I think one has to also remember that one of the problems of Europe is that there's not enough Europe, and it is often the member states who choose to spend this money. So basically the point is what Europe can do is innovation fund, and this is essentially where lots of the shipping money is going to be spent. I mean, there is more other things to say on it, but I suppose that's enough now.
What sort of size are we talking about for this innovation fund?
So it depends. So obviously it depends on the carbon price. So the previous, let's say essentially the previous version, which wasn't called the innovation fund, it was called NER 300. It was relatively small because the carbon price for a long time was too small, and so you didn't actually get much, let's say, innovation or much projects coming from that. In the innovation fund going forward, it is projected to have the next 10 years. I think it's 20 billion in the innovation fund for the next 10 years, and this is going to go up because today the carbon price is about 60. So if the carbon price goes up, which is not a given as well, I think that's also important to remember. It could also go back down. We're looking at more than 20 billion euros. So this, this is a tangible thing, and maybe one, just again to one of the things that we're asking for, as well as obviously infrastructure and things like this. We have to remember that the big, fuel cost is going to be the big cost for decarbonisation. So we want to see carbon contracts for difference. So basically, operational subsidies from the EU or from states to basically say to people who are deploying clean fuels, e-fuels, that we're going to pay the difference. So basically all that to say, it is big and it could get even bigger. And so we need to think, in conjunction with industry about what are really the best ways to use it.
Thanks. I don't know how many of the panel have had a look at the EU MRV data. I'd be interested to know that. And the MRV scheme, to me, is highly inaccurate, plus or minus 20%. And when we're talking about 20% allowances, this seems to be already a big error band. But I guess my main question is, and I've had a look at the database and the ships and stuff, I don't see any pattern there that's going to be used. And perhaps the panel has an insight on how are they going to use that MRV data to produce these allowances, or maybe I'm thinking totally wrongly. I don't know, but it looks a mess to me. Thank you.
Maybe Dan, we could start with you. And are you able to explain why the MRV data is quite so wrong? Dan, can you hear me?
Sorry, I cannot hear you so well, so that's it.
Did you hear the question from Donald Gregory just there? Well, the statement about the fact that the MRV data is, plus or minus 20% wrong most of the time. Do you have any explanation for that and how that can be improved? Because
I don't have the details. I cannot explain detail in that, but there is no doubt there is a new verify activity that will be introduced, and they're going to build up on the MRV reporting scheme. So it will be used. I don't have the exact scheme in front of me to explain how it will be, but it will be based on that.
Any questions at that stage?
I don't know. I'll just maybe make a statement there, Philip. I think the MRV scheme, you know, obviously we're reporting into the MRV scheme, and we have seen a number of cases where the ship types have been incorrectly reported. We've had a case where ships report, you know, because of a slip of the finger or thumb or whatever on the reporting mechanism, and it got through the verifier that the amount of carbon went into the fuel column, and therefore you ended up with 9 times the carbon allowance going through. And if you look at the number of changes there have been when the EU issues its final MRV report, you know, I can't remember. I don't know what version we're on now for 2020. Jacob, you probably can answer that. But I do remember a few years ago, I think we were on Rev 21 or something like that. But I think now it is more robust. There's no two ways about it. But I think this is key. You know, there's a lot building upon an existing framework, which then needs to have everybody retrained. And I think this is where, and again, I would come back to the fact that the MRV reporting for the ETS is one thing. There's going to be something similar but slightly different for Fuel EU Maritime. And I think this is where we've got to be careful. The layers of complexity that are getting added within all the different schemes that are going in. We've got a UK supposedly with an MRV scheme, which isn't in force yet, but is due to go into force next year. We're going to probably see something similar in other regions around the world. And this, I think, is where we as ship owners have our biggest challenge, because you then have, and we're used to dealing with this, I will say, and Jacob was right, you know, we are used to dealing with different things, but it does introduce more layers of complexity, which adds cost and makes it more challenging to get it right every time. And of course, compliance is absolutely essential for these things, because I think the other challenge we're going to see perhaps with an ETS being administered by a member state who has no direct link to that country or that company, other than the fact that that's their first port of call in Europe on that particular year. And I think that's also something as to when you start looking at how these funds, and Jacob is right, the Innovation Fund is something we've taken advantage of. It is the only area where you can go at the moment and get any funding, I think, to assist you. But I think if you're talking about member states and where they allocate that funding, where they look at where they're spending, if, for example, I don't know, maybe Rotterdam, maybe the Netherlands becomes a major key player in this role, because of course with the Europort, with their massive number of calls that are coming there for companies that are based outside of Europe. But what about the smaller states? What about those smaller destinations? You know, are they going to get their fair share? And that's something I think really needs to be looked at.
Maybe
sorry, I'll just add in that the MRV regulation will obviously have to be changed to take into account the new requirements, which are not yet detailed. So I think we have to wait and see, but there must be a revision coming up.
Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, just to briefly come back on that, Tom, I think it was, we do calculations on the MRV each year, and we got for 2019 we found version like 170 or something like this. So it does build up, but of course, I mean, as you say, it's about a process, and these things get better. And yeah, maybe just to clarify as well, in terms of the first port of call, in the legislation, I think it's where you've got the most ports of call rather than first. So I think you will probably get a situation where, you know, the Netherlands, Belgium are going to be kind of their authorities are going to be doing much better, but absolutely, it's going to be. And there is just a question in the chat, and maybe just to clarify, there won't be any free allowances in shipping. That the phase in is a kind, if you like, is a kind of like replacement for free allowances. And essentially free allowances, that they're very complicated in other sectors, but they're not a kind of integral part of the system. They're just something to kind of help businesses along, and they will be phased out anyway. So maybe just to clarify that, yeah.
Yeah, I understand that in aviation it will be phased out by 2026, 2027. Although we have a question online, 79 million allowances will be added to the EU-wide total to account for the inclusion of shipping. And the questioner is asking, why would there be no free allocation? Why would the EU not start off down that road as this scheme gets going?
Maybe just to really, from our perspective, I mean, the point is free allowances. There's a lot of reasons why they wouldn't work in shipping, because you've got so many sectors, you've got so much diversity. Free allowances in the power sector and other sectors is based on kind of benchmarks for efficiency, and if you achieve better than that benchmark, you get given some free allowances. In shipping, listen, I mean, you know, how are you going to find a fair kind of benchmark across sectors? It just wouldn't work. And then on top of that, you got, you know, for the liner sector, maybe there are benefits, but for the tramp sector, it's, you know, if you're in Europe 1 year, you know, and then you operate in Australia, then, you know, you're going to get free allowances. It doesn't quite work. And yeah, so free allowances in itself, it wouldn't work in shipping. And there is a very, very good argument to say that it doesn't work at all in the general sector, because the point is free allowances were there for a number of reasons, but essentially they haven't pushed decarbonisation. A lot of studies have shown they've actually done the opposite. So
I was going to say, and to reiterate what Jacob said before, you know, this is why they're, instead of having the free allowances, I mean, you could easily end up with a situation whereby, you know, somebody was calling for a reasonable period of time, eligible for free allowances, and then doesn't call at all and can now sell those in. In fact, it'd be better off not coming. You can go and sell them back in. So power stations can't move around the same way ships can. And so that's one of the most obvious things. So I think this is the reason why, to try and level the playing field. I think coming back to what Jacob said before about it would be very nice to have a cliff for the pricing, just to say make it now so it makes everybody sit up. But it wouldn't have been equitable. It wouldn't be fair to the people who are already in it who have the allowances. So as the allowances phase out, so the incremental piece comes up from the shipping.
Great. Thank you for that. So maybe we just move on a little bit and just talk more holistically about it. So there has been a bit of debate as to whether this is the best way to promote global decarbonisation of the shipping fleet. There's some interesting papers with advantages and disadvantages of using this. But one of the efforts, and Tom has mentioned this in passing, is the undermining of the IMO's global efforts to get a global system in place, and the fact that this is going to cause some tension with otherwise friendly nations, and may even lead to a proliferation, as Tom suggested might happen, of these schemes around the regions in the world. So do we think that this is the right way to decarbonise or to promote decarbonisation, Mark?
I think our stance at the moment is that, you know, anything is good, but at some point, you know, in this journey and earlier, you've got to try and join everybody up. So if you want one of the failings or one of the pieces that the EU can maybe adapt to is the fact that at the moment, you know, you're not actually pushing that money straight back into carbon projects. So you're not actually buying real carbon. And there are initiatives in other markets whereby what they're doing is that they're trying to get people to sell in carbon, either through commitments about, you know, mangrove swamps or forests, or even, you know, as carbon capture. And I think it's how that piece evolves that will really, if that piece doesn't fit in or the EU doesn't adapt to it, then of course that's when everything will fall apart and you end up with a bit of the Wild West. But just touching a little bit back on this, saying, you know, the ultimate way an owner can hedge, not necessarily for the liner companies or even the cruise companies, but from the spot owners, don't come. You know, just say, I'm not going to come. That's the easiest way to do it. And then you would sort of start putting up prices for those who specialize in trading it. So about managing the risk, don't come to the EU. You know, and that in itself will talk about carbon, you know, we talk about carbon slip if you want. If you have a situation whereby people just say, look, even at those low prices, I don't want to get involved. So I'm not going to send my ships there, leave it to those specialists. Those specialists start pushing up the prices, at which point it becomes economically viable for, stations in North Africa to tranship, maybe containers or anything else. Now, it's quite unlikely because of the cost, but 5 years ago, everybody said it was quite unlikely that hydrogen could be a fuel because of the cost, and now everybody's talking about this in terms of being a solution. So the markets and industries are very good at trying to work out, where that spread is or where the margin is.
Dan, do you see this, from your technical perspective, do you see that this is going to help? Do you think that there will be sufficient money coming out of innovation funds to assist? Do you think it will encourage?
I'm sure that there is I'm sure that this will have an impact, and the size of the impact depends the response and the enforcement, and to what extent trades elsewhere also will decarbonize. But I think we should remember that it's not just the ETS. There's a lot of other directives in here, and there's particularly one is the EU Fuel Maritime, which has the goal to increase the use of sustainable and decarbonation fuels, and all is in there. And I think that we also have to realize that the EU has had success in introducing new requirements, which have been taken up by IMO. So there is an aspect here that it is very likely that IMO will catch up, and so I think we should consider it as a one step. It's a proposal, so there is a lot of time to it will be discussed and so on. But I'm sure that IMO will include some of it, and it's our hope that we'll get to. We believe that it's going in the right sense. And as I mentioned, that obviously there's discussion about where the tax money will go, because there is this need for investment and quick investment. But I think I am confident that we will get to a good solution.
Thanks very much. Tom, do you think we're going in the right direction with this?
Very difficult to say. As we said, I don't look at the ETS in isolation. I have to look at the whole package that's being proposed in the Fit for 55 legislation. I go back when Carnival, there was an organization called Shipping, Emissions Abatement and Trading, and Don Gregory and some others in the room will remember this. Back in 2010, the first proposals were put on the table at the IMO for an emissions trading system. And, we're only now really having a real discussion about MBMs. And, I don't think any of us have, we flip-flop back between should it be a levy, should it be an ETS, should it be some other kind of system. I think clearly if we want to decarbonize and we want to decarbonize fast, there has to be some form of market-based measure. The challenge is what is the right one, and what do we make sure does not distort the marketplace so dramatically? And I really don't know at the moment if this is the right one, and that's where I think, and that's just me speaking as Tom Strang, not speaking as Carnival per se, but I think that's part of the challenge as we sit there in the cruise industry. As I've said, we're a major investor in infrastructure in Europe, whether it's through terminals, through the new build program, which is massive. Nearly all cruise ships are built in Europe, and when you're building billion-dollar assets, we don't have a design on the table yet for a zero-emission ship. We'd like to have our first zero-emission ships on the water in the 2030s. We want to be net zero operations by 2050. How do we get there? Is this the right tool? Maybe, maybe not. I think that's, but this is coming. I think whether we like it or not is clear. What I really want to make sure about is that whatever happens elsewhere as well, because this is not just Europe, this is happening in China, but there's a talk about something going on in North America. We know as you mentioned earlier, Phil, the UK has mentioned having their own emissions trading system and including international shipping in that emissions trading system. It needs, even relatively sophisticated companies like to have things made simple. If this can be simple and it can be easy to implement, if the costs can be then passed through the system in the right way, then that's clearly an advantage. And if we can see the benefits coming out with these new low carbon fuels coming online because of this, with the R&D being funded, with, as Jacob said, those subsidies being put in place, if I look at other parts of this not this directive, but the Fuel EU Maritime, as Dan mentioned, you know, the ship side, the onshore power supply, shore side electricity, it's unrealistic what's being discussed at the moment. And I think there's an awful lot here. And the challenge we see in the cruise segment and sector is that very little of any of the impact assessments were done, looked at what the benefits, what the challenges will be to our sector. Now, I'm not here to start, you know, there's no use crying over spilt milk, shall we say. But by the same token, once we're doing things that are going to make fundamental changes, it's got to be done on the basis of facts and reality. And I think that's really where I'm all for aspirations. We need those aspirations. You know, for those shipping companies that are members of Getting to Zero and these other coalitions, we feel that it's necessary. We need to get there. The question is, what is the right measure? We'll have to wait and see if this is the right measure. But as Mark said, you know, this could mean ship operators moving away from Europe, which would not be good for the economies of Europe. But I'm not, and I don't know, and I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that that's what we're planning to do, because we're clearly committed. And like I said, we see a lot that's good in this. We see a lot of challenges, and I think that's really understanding. I think what I hope is in the next few months, as we work through the analysis, talking to the Commission, talking to the Parliament and other stakeholders, that we can iron out those challenges and we can see some clarity around what this really is going to mean. Because at the moment, there's an awful lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, quite. And Jacob, I would guess that you would be, you know, very supportive of this, but taking Tom's point, you know, how long is it going to take to sort out this detail so that the shipping can embrace this confidently and understand the ramifications?
Yeah, so in terms of the time, and again, this is one of the ones where it all depends on the politics. It could. I think the Slovenian presidency at the moment want to wrap things up early next year, but again, it could it could take as much time as it, who knows. But I think it's true that the point is the sooner that the industry is clear about it, the better. I think there are a couple of things that come up, and I think in terms of this question of essentially leakage, first of all, will ships avoid Europe, and then will shipping companies move away? I think what we've seen in terms of the numbers, and I think this is what Mark kind of alluded to at the beginning, was that when it comes down to it, if we get a good system where prices are passed on, then this is it's in line with the general price fluctuation. So it's really is if the system works well from the practical side of it, there's no reason that it would have negative impacts in terms of European competitivity. So I think that's the first thing to say. And this is also when you would get the Baltic emissions control area, there were fears about people moving away from the Baltic, which didn't transpire. And I think this is one of the ones that, again, we have to work with the Commission and the institutions to make sure we get the right measure. And then I just to repeat something Dan said about the pushing at the IMO. It's the EU is going to do this, and it's got this goal of decarbonisation by 2050. And I think one of the benefits, I do kind of sympathise with Tom's point that we can't know that in 5 years' time is this going to be the best regulation. And also I think it is true that the ETS is one part of it, but the Fuel EU is probably for ship owners, for ship operators, going to be the more important piece of legislation. So is it the right way to do it? It's hard to tell, but I think again I want to come back. Again from our perspective, we should never forget that this is a crisis. We are in a situation where where the external costs are incredibly important and something needs to be done. So we need to work with industry, with authorities to get things together. And I think in terms of just the last thing, which could be a positive thing to say is for example, as the cruise industry, for example, in Europe, we have a strong industry. And why looking at if we get successful legislation, could we not get a world-beating green fuel industry as well as a kind of green cruise industry? There are opportunities here because as we will decarbonize hopefully before we go over 2%, but it will happen. So if Europe can lead on these new technologies, on these new fuels, then we're talking about opportunities. We're just talking about opportunities in terms of industry. So yeah, lots of different things there, but I hope that helps.
Thanks. So I'm just we've used up all our time. So I'm going to ask just the panelists just have a last think about what they want to say to finish up. And I just thought we had time for one question before we move on. Donald again.
Just I may, what does the panel think about what I feel is a rather prescriptive approach taken by the EU versus a goal-based approach? And, you know, there has been some U-turns because of mistakes made. And I think Tom sort of said that there's been not good assessment in some cases, and it's been kind of belief pushed rather than calculated assessment of what's the right solutions. So what's the panel between prescription, which seems to be the way the EU tends to go, versus let's set the goals and let industry sort it out?
Prescription versus.
Well, from my, you know, when we were involved, we're trying to price, you know, sulfur. We look at that. The only way you bring the industry together is if you're pushing them all over the cliff at the same time. So I think, you know, goalposts are an ideal scenario, but yeah, it makes it fair if everybody's falling over the cliff at the same time. You know, then they start working together.
Tom?
Yeah, and thanks, Dom, for that question. I think it's going to have to be a combination of both at the moment. I think ideally we'd want a level playing field worldwide where everything's on an even keel and basis, but that's not what appears to be happening. I think the EU has quite a prescriptive area here. There are some benefits, but no, I'm coming more and more to the feeling that, you know, regulation helps, but we've also got to have those goals, and there's got to be alternative ways of compliance within there. And I think some of that's built in. I'd like to see more. So I think it's got to be a mixture of both of them. And thanks, Mark. You know, we were all pushed over a cliff with some of it, but as you said, you know, I think we reacted well to the sulfur side of things. I think the bigger this is a much bigger challenge, though. I think this is the challenge of our lifetimes for ship operators and owners. You know, because this is not being driven commercially. This is being driven for different reasons, and as such, this is not, you know, doing the right thing from a commercial basis. It's doing the right thing for the survival of the planet. And I think that's, you know, that we've got to understand that, and that makes it much more challenging.
But you would think that, you know, if we are going to go over the cliff at the same time, it would be better at a global level and driven by the IMO rather than the regional approaches. Dan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. It has to be a mix of the two approaches. The prescriptive rules are important because it's something that can be rolled out very quickly. Obviously, we would like to see that it's the same rules everywhere in the world, and this is what we're going to work on. I think the whole industry is moving in that direction. But the goal is so important that we must keep a focus on where we want to go. And we have to have the two parts, because we also know that the investment cost we'll have to put in to get to that point we want to get to would be, the costs are enormous, and this is why we need the two, both goal setting and the prescriptive rules.
And Jacob, last word.
Yeah, I mean, as quick as I can, it's not prescriptive enough for us. I mean, essentially, I think there's two issues. Maybe the big issue for Tom is the OPS, is the onshore power supply, which is one thing. And we can kind of agree to disagree on that. But in terms of the general, so the ETS is as open as you like. You choose whatever you want to pay less, essentially, or you can pay. It's as flexible as you want. The fuel legislation is a goal-based one. And basically for us, it's not prescriptive enough at all. You're letting things like fossil natural gas, LNG in, which for us is incredibly problematic. We all read the methane report, IPCC this year. We have to reduce methane. We can't, we shouldn't be investing in it. And then biofuels as well. There's just not enough biofuels, so we need to go for e-fuels. So for us, fuel legislation should be more prescriptive, but we're not at this point pushing for prescriptive things. We're keeping with goal-based, and it can be better, but we just need to remember that the end goal, and the end goal is not LNG or biofuels. So maybe that I saw a couple of heads shaking there. Maybe it's too late to have a bit of debate on that, but I'll leave it there.
Great. So thanks very much. Do you want a last word, Mark?
Well, I think I pick up on a couple of points. I think, you know, it was mentioned, you know, the IMO has been brought up, and I think it was mentioned about fuel levies. And in the discussions that we've been involved with, for me, it's become reasonably clear that there's going to have to be a mix. And I initially used to look at that mix and saying the reason why was because the fuel levy can raise money quite quickly. And if you focus that towards, effectively carrots or incentives or spreading the gap between those fuels to make them more cost effective, that's a really good, quick way to do it. But, governments, regions, they like trading schemes because they get their hands on the money and they can set the cost of carbon. And so I do think there's going to be a bit of a hybrid approach. And in an ideal world, what you would have is a levy that was based upon the carbon content of the fuel, and somehow that was recognized in those trading venues. And so what you end up with is the levy is global, and then you end up with the trading, like the ETS, regional, and saying, yeah, there's an offset. You've already paid some, so now you've just got to pay the extra to deal with us. And so that way you can have different paces going forward. Yeah. And to me, that would be the hybrid model that really, that could be acceptable. But we need the IMO to push forward a bit more or start making a decision, on that side of things.
Sure. And Tom, you want the last word?
Well, I'm not going to start an argument with Jacob over LNG because you can see the ships behind me that I have there, because we firmly believe that LNG has a role to play in this transition. No, I think this has been an interesting discussion. I think clearly there's a lot more to be talked about, a lot more to understand before we end up in the final position on this. And I think, things are moving though now, and I'm a great believer. I've got to look at this in the glass half full. I think shipping can come together and can solve some of these problems. It's going to be challenging though, and to Mark's point, I kind of shudder a little bit when I think about a very hybrid scheme where everything's got to interact and one party's got to say, oh, I'm going to accept what somebody's taken somewhere else. I find that hard to believe, from the experiences we've had in other areas. But no, this is something that's coming, whether we like it or not, and we've just got to, get on and find the best way to deal with this and make it work.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure we could talk about this for hours more, but we have to call it a halt there. So, I mean, it's really interesting, and the message that keeps coming across is this is an enormous challenge. There's an awful lot of work to do to, both EU and in the industry to try to work out how we deal with this. But I think the key issues are going to be how do we pass these charges on to the customer? How do we make it fair so that the ship owner is not penalised, certainly in the short term, and what does shipping get out of it? So I think if shipping thinks that there would be an innovation fund where there's real investment in new fuel and infrastructure and all those things which will help shipping decarbonise, I think that there will be a much more relaxed reaction than if the innovation fund is squirreled away and we lose transparency. But where is the money going, and why isn't it being used to decarbonise? So I'd like to thank Mark and Dan and Jacob and Tom very much for joining us. I was very sorry that we didn't manage to connect with Harry. And thank you all for joining, both virtually and here today. We've really enjoyed International Shipping Week. I think it's been a real success, and it's made a success by people coming along to these events and contributing and listening and joining in the conversation. So I'd like to thank everybody very much for coming, and that's it from us today.